Now, most of us who are even casual observers know about the Roswell crash of the UFO, supposed alleged UFO, in July of 1947. And those who get a little deeper into it know about an incident with a businessman and pilot here in Washington State by the name of Kenneth Arnold. That was a couple of weeks before Roswell, where he claims to have seen several unidentified flying objects flying at high speed, looking at them against Mount Rainier until they vanished. But what a lot of people don't know about, and it's starting to hopefully to get some more attention, is an incident a few days before Kenneth Arnold's sighting on Maury Island. And joining me to talk about it is Steve Edmiston, who has made himself an historian and expert on the Maury Island sighting. Steve, thanks for joining me. Tell me about what these people saw, if you would, on Maury Island.
Well, hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the program. What a great story. I'm so happy to share it. I enjoy this. So thank you. So here we go. On June 21, so yesterday, 67 years ago now, June 21, 1947, a man named Harold Dahl, who lived in Tacoma, went out on his boat. It was a 50-foot working boat. He went out with his son Charles. He picked up two day workers at the docks in Tacoma. And the reason they were out on Puget Sound that day is they wanted to go and collect loose logs that would be floating on the sound that had fallen off the log booms, and then resell them back to the company. And so that's why they were out off Maury Island around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And the story goes that they saw 6 flying discs, hollow in the middle, shaped like donuts, if you will. They didn't know or understand what they'd seen. And they hovered there. One seemed to be failing a little bit. It was lower than the other 5. And then suddenly it started to release what they called a chaff-like material, like when you burn a newspaper in a bonfire and it floats up in the air. They were seeing that come off this one flying disc. And then there was an explosion. And after the explosion, they alleged that a molten material, and they call it slag, like a molten lava type, started to rain down on them. And that slag was so thick and heavy, it damaged the boat. It killed the family dog, Sparky, who they had brought on the boat that day. It burned Charles Dahl's, the son's arm. And they were so frightened that Harold alleges that he took his boat and he ran it ashore on Maury Island. And this is a very big boat to run ashore, right? That's an emergency situation. They get off the boat and they hide in the cliffs. And a few minutes later, all 6 saucers, even the one that appeared damaged, leave. They're just gone. And they get back on the boat and they decide and get it out in the water, and they decide that they are not going to talk about this. They don't understand what they've seen. They're very frightened and they don't know how to explain it. And on that day, the decision is not to talk. And that's basically the sighting. That's the basic facts of day 1 of the Maury Island incident.
So, as I understand it, the next day was when we saw the first appearance of what we've come to know as the Men in Black. But if they weren't talking about it, how did the government or whomever this person works for know to contact these people?
Great question. So I think the assumption has to be that, whoever these individuals were, whoever this Men in Black was, whoever he worked for, absolutely knew what was going on and observed it themselves. And they observed that in this area, here's this, poor guy on his boat, right? Experiencing something that maybe he wasn't supposed to see. And so the story goes, Harold Dahl's story goes that on the morning of on June 22nd, the day after this sighting, early in the morning, a man comes to his house in Tacoma, knocks on the door, and surprise, the man is dressed in black. He's got the black suit and the black tie and the white shirt and the black shoes and the fedora. He's arrived in a 1947 black Buick. This is all information that we glean from FBI records. So, we're not, that's where our storytelling comes from. And the man knocks on the door. Harold answers, and the man basically says, I know what happened to you on the water yesterday. We need to discuss it. We probably shouldn't do it here where his wife and his son are there. And so they decide to go to a diner in Tacoma, and they go to the diner, and in the diner, this man in black recounts to Harold everything that happened to Harold the day before, just like I just recounted to you. Just says, here's everything that happened to you on the water. And then he did what we now know men in black do. He issued the warning. He told Harold, you shouldn't talk about anything that you saw on the water yesterday. If you do, there are consequences. Bad things will happen, not just to you, but to your family, your business. Don't talk about it. And that's sort of the day two of the Maury Island incident, is this appearance of a man in black. And just so your people that are watching this understand the gravity of that, true, not true, allegation, fiction, or truth, that's the first time that we can sort of ascertain in history that someone said this thing called the Men in Black came to them and gave that warning, right? So everything we now know today, the $2 billion film franchise Men in Black, the X-Files, all that story that we live in as a matter of pop culture legacy came from June 22nd, the story that Harold Dahl told about the Men in Black. I find that absolutely fascinating to understand that legacy starts here in the Northwest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know Roswell certainly, created a phenomenon that has appeared in pop culture. I mean, we've all seen The Day the Earth Stood Still and Plan 9 from Outer Space and all of these movies that have come since about, alien invasions and that sort of thing. But I'm curious now because the dolls decided they weren't going to talk about it. Then the man in black, I guess, single man, shows up. And then I guess they start to talk about it because the story has gotten out. Well, what changed? Was it the appearance of the guy that they said, well, this guy's not going to come threaten me, or what happened?
Yeah. So the next part of the story, when I recount the whole story, if I'm giving a talk, I'm always like, and this is where it gets weird. So you've just heard about the UFO sighting and like, no, that is not even the weird part. This is where it starts to get strange. So, there's a man named Fred Chrisman, and he's a business partner of Harold Dahl. He isn't on the boat that day, but basically after that day, Chrisman is an advocate for getting this word out. He thinks this is a great story, and he connects with a man named Ray Palmer, who's actually one of the editors of Amazing Stories magazine, those pulp magazines in the 1940s and 1950s. So Palmer is behind those. He hasn't launched Fate magazine yet. That'll be 1948. But he loves this kind of, aliens. So Chrisman appears to be the guy that is prodding, tell the story, and I'll help you tell the story. So that's what kind of changes, and they decide they're going to go ahead and tell this story. And interesting, now if we just take one moment and contextualize what's happening, this is 1947. We are 2 years out of World War II. We have just decided, President Truman has just said, we're at war with this thing called the Soviet Union. We're in a Cold War. He just announced in May the containment doctrine. And what starts to happen in the country is everybody starts seeing little flying saucer disc sightings and unexplained things in the air. We have the famous sighting by Kenneth Arnold just 3 days after Maury Island at Mount Rainier. Kenneth Arnold sees 9 flying discs around Mount Rainier. The Roswell incident that you talk about is 2 weeks later. So people don't realize these things were all happening at the same time. So on July 8th, we have the Roswell alleged crash. And through this summer, which the press labels the summer of the saucers, there are not just hundreds or thousands, it's like tens of thousands of reported sightings. part of that's probably pop culture at the time. It's like, hey, it's fun. Let's pretend we saw something or create a video. But of course, a lot of it is not explainable. And what happens in the summer of 1947 is the branches of our government take it seriously because of this Cold War threat. And if people are seeing things in the sky in 1947, they're probably not worried about little green men, but they are definitely worried that their new opponent, the Soviet Union, could be overflying us with technology we don't yet have or understand. So they, the FBI, the Army, the newly formed CIA are all starting to investigate this, which we know from all the records that we've recovered over the years under the Freedom of Information Act. They're taking it seriously, and they finally get to Maury Island, that alleged sighting that has now become part of this newspaper story. And the Army assigns 2 intelligence officers to fly to Tacoma, Washington, to interview Harold Dahl. This is at the end of July. We're winding through the summer. And they meet Harold Dahl along with Ken Arnold, who's become kind of a celebrity at this point because he's so credible as a UFO witness. They meet at the hotel and they kind of interrogate. They have this meeting where they're saying, what did you see? And what happened? Fred Chrisman actually brings a cornflake. I love the visuals, the cornflake box of the slag that fell from the flying discs, gives it to the intelligence officers. They conclude their business late night, July 31. They go to McChord Air Force Base. This is where it gets unbelievable. They get on to a B-25 bomber, which is what these intelligence officers who are pilots have been flying around the U.S. to investigate, because I guess a B-25 was the Uber of 1947. And they manifest the slag as top secret cargo. We know that from Final Mission Report. They get in that B-25 bomber. They pick up 2 servicemen who are also going to be flying down to California. And they take off in the middle of the night on August 1. And that's an important day. August 1, 1947 is the day that it's called Air Force Day. And it's the day that the Air Force separated from the Army permanently. And so these 2 individuals, these intelligence officers, are now Air Force officers. And they want to go to the celebrations down in California. And they get on that plane and they take off from McChord and they make it about 45 minutes into the flight with the top secret cargo. And the plane spontaneously catches fire, crashes in the forest east of Kelso, Washington. The 2 pilots perish in the crash. They're very heroic. Before the crash, they were able to get parachutes on their 2 passengers. Those 2 passengers survived, but the pilots perished in the crash. They're the first 2 fatalities in the history of the United States Air Force as a separate branch of the military. So the story takes a dark and tragic turn. And I'll take a break and take a question, but this is when the FBI gets involved and J. Edgar Hoover. Very exciting.
Interesting. So I want to back you up because a couple of times you've mentioned you've looked at reports by way of the Freedom of Information Act. What did those reports reveal that we might not have heard about?
Oh, that's great. So the most robust set of documents that we've seen that are useful for the Maury Island incident are FBI documents. And so after this crash, the FBI is involved investigating the crash. It's sort of our X-Files in 1947, and the field agent Jack Wilcox is sort of our Agent Mulder, because he's been handed this airplane crash, and it turns out to be a UFO story. I mean, it's an X-Files episode, right? But so we got all those FBI records, also got Army records, also got CIA records. Most of those, the bulk of them, come from what's called the vault. And what's happened is, you probably know this, that the number one Freedom of Information Act query for decades, number one, more important apparently to everybody to know, is UFOs, right? I mean, that is far and away the most request for the government of documents is UFOs. So they've gotten so many of these, they've created what's called the vault. In other words, they've just moved everything that they say they have into the vault, and you can go, it's a playground, and you can go research it. So the bulk of what we were able to get was from the vault. Now, what's important is um, most of the Maury Island records were sealed for 50 years after the crash. So we don't, it sort of lost its place in the history of the world. But to get to your question, that's how we got the documents. The reason those documents are so important and the FBI records are so important is that after the plane crash, the FBI conducted this investigation for a number of weeks. J. Edgar Hoover's personally involved because apparently he's a little bit weird. We probably heard he has all kinds of eccentricities, and he was also very interested in UFOs. Just go figure. And so he would personally write teletypes to the field agents, and they would respond directly to the director of the FBI in 1947. Stunning. And what happened was Harold Dahl. So many bad things actually happened, right? The Men in Black warned, if you talk, bad things will happen. These bad things happened to Harold Dahl, that he began to say, if I would rather be known as the biggest liar that ever lived. I want to be a hoaxer, as opposed to the ridicule that I have received for saying I saw something. That ridicule and the bad things, that his business was vandalized, his wife became sick, just bad things happened to him. He said, I got to take another path. And that path was to create a fabrication. And that fabrication was the idea that I made it all up. So that's going on. And Harold Dahl's feeding that story to the press after the airplane crash. So J. Edgar Hoover, who's getting daily reports, writes to his field agent, Jack Wilcox, and says, oh, it looks like this is a hoax. And so we can just close the case. And for us that love this story, this memo, this teletype that was written by the field agent in response to J. Edgar Hoover directly. It's one page, direct response from a lowly field agent to the director of the FBI. And it contains these 4 words: Dahl did not admit. And those 4 words are embedded in basically an explanation of, you're wrong, Director Hoover. Dahl did not admit that this is a hoax. He saw what he saw, but he's now going to claim he's a liar to make it go away. And so why haven't we heard about Maury Island? Why is Roswell got all the oxygen? Well, it's because for 50 years, we were all allowed to believe that this was a hoax, that Dahl had completely recanted his statement. And what we have learned from the actual government records from the FBI is that was never true. Dahl actually never retracted in multiple interviews with the FBI that he'd seen something. He just said, I'm going to start saying this because I'd rather be a liar. That's what I'd rather be. Isn't that amazing? I just couldn't believe it when I learned all that.
Well, I have to say, if you're getting harassed by essentially secret government agents or whomever is doing it, I would probably want to do the same thing to make it go away. Absolutely.
And there's a long statement to Hoover in a long report that ends the investigation from Wilcox. And multiple times in that report, Wilcox writes that, he just wants to make it go away. He's going to claim to be the biggest liar that ever lived. Those are quotes. And, he just can't deal with this anymore. But he says he saw what he saw. That part never goes away. And that's what was lost to history for 50 years, because nobody knew that part until we learned about the story and kicked the rocks and, got into the dustbin of history and, started looking at these documents. And, the story is the story. When we made our movie, The Maury Island Incident, we relied on those documents. We didn't want to do anything other than say, this is what was reported to the FBI. This is, if we got to take a peek in, Mulder and Scully's files, that's what we wanted to rely on.
So I got to ask you a side question because it's been weighing on me. Was there anything in those documents that indicated that the slag was tested, that they ever figured out what the material was?
Yeah, no. So what happened, the only thing we actually know that happened to the slag, and I'm talking about the slag that was given to those intel officers and on that ill-fated B-25 bomber. When that bomber crashed in the forests east of Kelso, it was rugged territory where it crashed, and they flew the next day. They flew a platoon of soldiers down from McCord, and they hiked in and they sealed the crash off. Didn't let anybody from local law enforcement enter the site, and they brought in more intelligence officers. And this we know from the Army's final mission report, because this is all how it went step by step. They brought in more intelligence officers, and those intelligence officers stayed on the scene until they recovered, guess what? The top secret cargo that had been placed, the slag that had been placed in the navigator's kit. And this is just what I'm reading in the Army's report. And when they recovered the top secret cargo and took it and left the site, the Army left and just handed the site off to local law enforcement. And so now the question that you're at is, what happened to the slag? Did we find out what it was? Did we test it? Well, never heard about that final mission report and that statement that was taken by that intelligence officer. That's it. That's all we know about it. And I kind of always joke, I think it's parked right next to Indiana Jones' Ark of the Covenant in that big warehouse that you never see again. So we don't know. There have been alleged testing of other materials that people allege they brought whatever from Maury Island. So I've seen some, I think in the Ken Arnold book from 1953, The Coming of the Saucers, there's some discussion of testing, and it suggests that some of it's unexplainable. Then there's some discussion of testing from another source that says, oh, it just looks like it could be slag from the Asarco mine. And I don't have an answer to your question other than, it's one of the, I love those kind of mysteries. I think those are if we had more attention on Maury Island, maybe we would get more research on Maury Island. I don't know how many books have been written by Roswell. I should look that up someday. But we have zero we have one that I'm aware of, Maury Island. And I think that's because it was dismissed as a hoax. So it isn't worthy of research if it's a hoax. But if we can kind of get over that issue, I think maybe we can probably learn a lot more, as we have more people diving into the history.
Indeed. And the other thing I want to make a note of, since we've talked about Ken Arnold a couple of times, it was Mr. Arnold's conversation with the reporter from the Oregonian newspaper that led to the creation of the term flying saucer, which is how we got that, and probably how we ended up with, like I mentioned, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and those movies, showing the spaceships as saucer shaped. Like we all sort of, got that into our minds.
That's 100%. That's 100% correct. That is a Ken Arnold off the cuff description of what he saw. And that has survived the test of time, and it doesn't matter if we start calling them UAPs or whatever we relabel them at, there's going to be a significant number of folks who just go, you know what, flying saucers and UFOs.
Well, and if memory serves, I should probably also throw in that there was just within a couple of days after the Ken Arnold sighting, down near southern Washington, I believe some military personnel had seen something going on down there too. And correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but it wasn't just Ken Arnold, wasn't just Maury Island. There was a couple other things going on. And I, several months back, spoke with a fellow who calls himself the UFO detective, and he's pretty knowledgeable on this stuff. And, he had mentioned that in one of those situations, the witnesses said these saucers went into what looked like just some sort of vortex that opened up and vanished. So, I mean, if that kind of technology was existing in the 1940s, and it was indeed of extraterrestrial origin, that's some pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, and historically, you're right. There were numerous sightings in Washington State, particularly early during this period in 1947. And I would point out, and before, so you're counting Maury Island and Ken Arnold, and then lots of other sightings in Washington State and Idaho and Oregon before Roswell. So, I mean, if you sort of, if you want to think about, for some reason during this period of time, there was a lot a lot of visitation happening. It seems like it kind of started in this Pacific Northwest region and then migrated, around, which doesn't seem, overwhelmingly complex from a technological standpoint if you can do what they're doing, right? Taking a tour, maybe it's a tourism stop for extraterrestrials. But yes, Washington is sort of the geographic epicenter of all the earliest recounting of all these sightings.
So the other thing too that Jim, the UFO detective, mentioned is that a lot of these sightings were near nuclear sites, and it sort of jibes with the start of the Cold War and the possibility that if they were aliens, they were worried about us using nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. So that would certainly play into it as well. So we are running out of time in our chat, but I want to make sure I get in. You are holding a celebration this evening. Is this something that you do every year?
Well, we have done a private version of this for over a decade called Burning Saucer, and it's really a fun community event. But last year, because it was so popular, we added on 6/22 what we call the Men in Black Birthday Bash, and we are absolutely all dressed in black and white. And so we have a lot of traditional men in black and women in black, and then we have a lot of really experimental men in black, which I love. And we have music, but the important part is that we have story embedded between music. So we really are embracing this as a local history and local mythology, and wanting to elevate it and have a lot of fun with it at the same time. That's at the Quarter Deck in Des Moines, here south of Seattle, that we hold that. And then we're having a movie festival the next night. And then we have a big music event on the next night. So it's quite a weekend for us. Now, all of our events have sold out, and that's good news for us, except we have a few tickets remaining for the Saturday night. It's a great black and white bash with Frank Sinatra at the Sands. So it's a big band. It's just going to be a hoot. And so if someone's heard this and they want to come to something, that's the one. I think it's called A Night at the Sands with Frank Sinatra, starring Joey Jewell, and it's a fundraiser. So that's still possible. You can find out all about this stuff at www. Guess what? MIB 622. Men in Black 622.
MIB622.com. That's easy enough. And since you mentioned it's a fundraiser, what are we raising funds for?
Well, Des Moines Legacy Foundation. Des Moines Legacy Foundation is kind of the presenting sponsor of that event, and they do all kinds of good work supporting causes that impact children. And so it's a whole bunch of things, from musical instruments for kids to health related issues for kids to parks for kids to recreation for kids. They've got a lot of causes that they support, kind of in this region in South King County. And so there's a worthy cause you can find there.
Indeed, sounds like it. All right, Steve Edmiston, appreciate you taking the time, and enjoy the party tonight. And you're a Des Moines guy. I've gotten used to calling it Des Moines. Whatever you want to call it is fine. That is the perpetual debate that will never end. In fact, that story for us will come. It's been a while since that story came up again, so I might need to do the "Is it Des Moines or is it Des Moines" story once again. But Steve, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Good to be here.